Welcome. We are thrilled to be presenting a timely panel entitled Court Fees and Surcharges, Reforms and Post-Pandemic Impact. This webinar today is sponsored by the ABA Standing Committee on Legal Aid and Indigent Defense, the ABA Government and Public Sector's Lawyers Division, and our hosts, the ABA section on Civil Rights and Social Justice. This panel is one of many in a series of rapid response webinars on interesting and present topics of public policy. We're actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. Before we begin, I would like to turn things over to ABA President Patricia Lee Rifo for a few remarks. President Rifo?
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. This is such an important topic. Over the past 2 decades, the use of fees and surcharges and other monetary costs in the criminal justice system has expanded rapidly, particularly for misdemeanors and minor infractions. These fees are rarely tailored to an individual's financial circumstances, despite longstanding precedent that individuals should not be penalized for the inability to pay because doing so violates the Constitution. There can be harsh consequences for those who cannot pay these charges. In many jurisdictions, failure to pay can result in an arrest warrant or jail time. In other jurisdictions, debt collection practices that coerce payment from defendants, many of whom, of course, live at or below the poverty line, simply drive them deeper into poverty. In most jurisdictions, individuals who cannot pay can have their driver's license suspended as punishment, which, of course, then hinders them from being able to work to pay their fines and fees, or subjects them to further criminal punishment for driving with a suspended license. Failure to pay can also result in the deprivation of fundamental rights, including the right to vote. The American Bar Association has long sought to address these important issues. In 2018, the House of Delegates of the American Bar Association adopted the ABA 10 guidelines on court fines and fees. They provide straightforward and coherent guidelines to help judges, court administrators, legislators, and advocates craft fair and just solutions. These guidelines require the consideration of the ability to pay at the time a fee is imposed, and again, before an individual is sanctioned for the non-payment of those fees and fines. They prohibit incarceration and other disproportionate sanctions, including driver's license suspensions for failure to pay. And they require transparency regarding the collection of fines and fees. Today at this terrific webinar, you will hear from policymakers who have worked to reform the fines and fees systems in their jurisdictions in important ways. Their success in this work has improved the justice systems in their jurisdictions and moved us ever closer to the concept of equal justice, a concept to which all of us aspire. I am now pleased to turn you over to your moderator for today's program, Lisa Foster, who currently serves as co-director of the Fines and Fees Justice Center. Lisa is also a former judge and the former director of the Office of Access to Justice of the United States Department of Justice. She is one of our nation's foremost experts on this topic. Lisa, thank you for being here today, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Patricia. It's a pleasure to be here, and good day to everyone. President Rifo has done a terrific job of explaining the problem of fines and fees. And we have a wonderful panel to talk about how we're solving the problem of fines and fees. Before I introduce that panel to you, let me just make 2 brief observations. First, when the movement for fines and fees truly launched, which was after Michael Brown, a young Black man, was murdered by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. The community exploded and the Justice Department investigated. At that point, the country really woke up to the problem of fines and fees, and a reform movement was launched. In those early days, most of us believed that the problem was really the fines and fees imposed when someone was convicted of a criminal offense or a minor violation, like a traffic ticket or a municipal code violation. What we've learned since is that fees in particular are ubiquitous throughout the criminal legal system. They start before a person is even arrested with, for example, a warrant fee. And they run through the time that they are in prison or jail with fees for phone calls, and even after they've completed their sentence, when many jurisdictions charge fees to pay your fines and fees. We've also learned that the problem exists at every level of government, which is why we have the panel we do today. At the municipal level, there are municipal code violations. There are things like impound and towing fees for your vehicles, library fines, all of which, together with the fines and fees imposed in the criminal legal system at the county level, at the state level, are extracting billions of dollars from our lowest income communities, and particularly from communities of color. The second observation is that we are making remarkable progress. There has been a lot of reform that's been achieved in the last 5 years. In the last 3 years, for example, 15 states have ended driver's license suspensions for unpaid fines and fees. That is rapid movement on an issue in this country. And we are seeing reform, again, at the local, at the county, at the state, and at the federal level. Which brings us to our panel today. So the bios of our panelists are in your materials. I am just going to provide a brief introduction to them today. Melvin Carter is the mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota. He was elected to office in 2017 and has launched an agenda to truly transform St. Paul into a city that is more equitable for everyone. Holly Mitchell is currently a supervisor, a member of the Board of Supervisors of the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors. She represents over 2 million Los Angelinos in that position. She was formerly a state senator in California, and before that, a member of the state assembly. Senator William Smith is a state senator from the state of Maryland, and he too served as a member of the House of Delegates in Maryland before he was elected to the Senate. Sarab Sagvi is a counsel to U.S. Senator Chris Coons of Delaware on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And last but certainly not least, Brett Richards serves as legislative counsel to Senator Roger Wicker of the state of Mississippi in the United States Senate. So because all politics is local, we're going to start with Mayor Carter. I'm going to ask each of our panelists some questions and then turn it over to the audience to ask some questions. So Mayor Carter, you issued an executive order about a year ago in April of last year to address the impact of fines and fees during the pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit about what was in that executive order and what led you to make an order about fines and fees?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. This is something that's critical to us. Look, the entire purpose of government in the first place is to equitably provide those types of services that are too precious, that are too critical for us to sort of rely on kind of forces of supply and demand. So when we, as the public sector, rely on fines and fees to help us kind of make our budgets, we limit access to things like driver's licenses, things like cars, things like water, clean water, things like library books, those things that people absolutely need to survive, to thrive in our economy. And so that executive order you're talking about actually built on some work that we've done before that. we created an Office of Financial Empowerment in my first year in office. And one of the big concepts we brought in my first year as mayor was to eliminate library fines. We found that library fines, while we all think they make people bring their books back, in reality, they make people stay away from the libraries, sometimes for a lifetime. And so we eliminated library fines a few years back. In quarter one of that policy, we saw double-digit increases in library use in all of our lowest income communities, which demonstrate very clearly what the impact of those policies were in the first place. They were blocking access to free information to those people in our lowest income neighborhoods. And so last spring, when the pandemic hit, we suspended water shutoffs so that every family can afford to wash their hands in a pandemic. We waived impound fees and invited people whose cars were in impound to come and get their cars for free. We saved our residents $53,000 in fines where that's concerned. And we stopped, we delayed collection of assessments. We stopped any debt collection to just tell our residents, we know this is a crisis. We want to keep money in your pockets. Our residents appreciated it greatly, and hopefully it was a big part of helping them see their way through this past year.
Thank you. Supervisor Mitchell, when you were state senator, you championed SB 144, the Families Over Fees Act, which is now the law in California, and eliminated many of the fees that the state allowed counties to impose on people in the criminal legal system. Can you talk a little bit more about the content of SB 144 and, again, what caused you to address this issue? And if you would, whether you feel any differently about it now that you're at the county level?
Not at all, Lisa, because it was the right thing to do for all of the reasons that you shared in your introduction. So thank you so much for the opportunity to participate today. You know, we titled our act Families Over Fees to be very clear about what our intention was, because we know that, you know, over the course of several decades, the collective we at the state level, the federal level, have criminalized poverty. The burdens we put on people who are struggling every day are so extreme, and most middle income and high income earning people don't have those same burdens and don't even understand what we've done to our lowest income families across this country. And so Senate Bill 144 was really part of a larger package of bills that I carried, co-authored with now Insurance Commissioner Ricardo Lara, who was my sitting colleague in the Senate at the time, where we were focused on right-sizing our criminal and juvenile justice system. And I emphasize the term right-sizing because we realized that the pendulum had swung too far in one direction for far too many years. And based on years of research, now that we are able to Monday morning quarterback and realize that, you know, we went too far, realizing that incarcerating people for longer periods of time does not make for a safer society. We had a package of bills to really right size and make our criminal and juvenile justice system more appropriate, quite frankly. And the fines and fees were an element. What was fascinating as we went through this bill, and this bill took us a couple times to get it done. First, we did juvenile, then we went back, was really getting a clear picture about what fines and fees were really being charged to really be able to wrap our arms around it. You know, there are 58 counties in California, 54 were charging fines and fees. My home county of LA County on their own stopped the practice a number of years prior to the passage of SB 144. And every county across the board was different. We knew that was a challenge. But fundamentally, thanks to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and any number of other academic proposals, UC Berkeley Law Clinic did a lot of work. We recognized that they were unjust, high paying, and low gain, disproportionately harming the people least able to afford them. What was so offensive to me, even as now a member of local government, that there were counties that were spending more to collect the fines and fees than they actually collected. And so how they could even justify that action was absurd to me. And even when we had ability to pay protections in place in California, there were counties that were ignoring that and continuing to charge people who met the criteria for their lack of ability to pay. And so we were proud to get it done. We did a bit of a dual strategy. I chaired the Senate Budget Committee for my last 4 years in the Senate. And so, when we began to hear kind of the typical refrain, good policy, Holly, but how are we going to afford it? We have to keep counties whole. That's when we began to dig deeper to really try to figure out who was charging what and for what, to come up with the list, the biggest offenders of fines and fees, to completely eliminate those, create, some wiggle room for some of the fines dealing with DV abusers and those charged with vehicular criminal neglect. So there were some that were maintained, but those weren't the biggest offenders. Even those we put in policies for ability to pay. And so as budget chair, it was my responsibility to really work with the Department of Finance to figure out how we make counties whole in providing some of the services they claim these fines and fees paid for, in terms of a number of the training programs that they claim they paid for. So we really worked hard to figure out what the real price tag was, not just what they collected in the fines and fees. We were able to backfill through the state budget resources to counties to pay for what we felt was appropriate. Government should pay for government services. Poor people shouldn't be double taxed. They pay taxes anyway, which fill our coffers, and so they shouldn't be taxed and expect to pay these additional fines and fees. So it was a dual strategy, the piece of legislation, as well as a budget strategy to make counties whole as we deemed appropriate.
Thank you. Senator Smith, you sponsored a bill to address fees and costs that were charged in the juvenile justice system. I think something most people don't even realize is that the fines and fees that are assessed against adults are also often assessed against children or their parents or guardians. So can you talk about the bill that you successfully championed in Maryland? And again, what brought your attention to this issue?
Well, thank you, Lisa, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. And if I may, Melvin and Holly, thank you for the work you've done. Definitely look forward to working with you all, so we definitely got to connect afterwards, because although we've done a lot of significant things in Maryland, we still got much to do in California, and Melvin, the mayor, for their leadership. So what we did here in Maryland under this bill, I sponsored it for a couple of years, and it actually passed after I passed it off to a friend of mine who's in the House of Delegates. I was able to usher it through while I was chairman of the committee over here in the Senate. But essentially what it did is it eliminated the authority of the court to impose fines against youth, their parent, or their guardian under certain circumstances, and then also did that for best interest and attorney's fees, again, for that youth, their parent, or their guardian. And I became aware of this issue through a constituent matter. A constituent phoned in, I did some preliminary research, and then I reached across to a colleague of mine, Delegate Eric Barron in the House, who had a great interest in these issues. And so we teamed up and put together this piece of legislation. Now, obviously for juveniles in poverty, the fines and fees levied against them by a court can create those insurmountable barriers that we've all been talking about here this afternoon, which ultimately results in higher levels of recidivism, financial hardship, and can exacerbate those racial and ethnic inequalities in the criminal justice system that both of our panelists so far have highlighted. The imposition of these fines and fees also provides very little rehabilitative effect. And that's highlighted and supported by the Justice Department, and also a study by the Civil Rights Commission, that not only do they have very little or no rehabilitative effect, that they disproportionately impact youth of color compared to their white counterparts, which then again ultimately results in higher recidivism rates for youth of color. And so when you get down to it, in the final analysis, families shouldn't have to choose between paying court fees and fines or supporting their basic needs like food or rent. This, I think, dovetails nicely with some of the other work that we've done in the justice system. For instance, in Maryland, we've just passed the Juvenile Restoration Act, which doesn't deal with fines and fees, but there is a nexus there between this criminal process and the fines and fees, because obviously the Supreme Court has time and again recognized the difference between the development of juvenile minds and adult minds, and that process of maturation, and how our justice system has to treat juveniles differently in both systems. And I think that those fines and fees in this system highlight the need for that reform. We've also done a lot of innovative things in Maryland You spoke to, we're one of those 14 or 15 states that did that, did away with the driver's license suspensions. Our Attorney General now has put forth an aggressive package to include a proposal that gets rid of that a body attachment, those show cause orders, which the underlying offense is a fine or a fee. So we've got some innovative things going on in Maryland, but still much to do. And I look forward to connecting with Holly and Melvin and the rest to get some more ideas that we can do here in the State House in Maryland. So I appreciate being with you and look forward to the conversation ahead.
Thank you. And let me just note, interestingly, so California, Mississippi, and Maryland have all addressed driver's license suspensions. We're still waiting on Minnesota. It's coming soon, Mayor Carter, I think, but maybe this year. But let me turn now, Mr. Sanghvi, to you at the federal level. So Senators Coons and Wicker introduced the Driving for Opportunity Act just last week. Can you explain what the act does and also why the federal government's involved at all in this issue, which is mostly about fines and fees imposed by cities, counties, and states?
Absolutely, Lisa. And thanks so much for moderating this panel and for the ABA for hosting. It's a real honor to be among such distinguished panelists. When Senator Coons looked at this issue first a few years back, it was because of the Ferguson report that Lisa had mentioned and kind of became aware of this issue. I think the theme that jumped down, the theme that you've heard today from the panelists is not only the human cost here, but also just how kind of pointlessly counterproductive is what we do on fines and fees. And I think you certainly see that with driver's license suspensions and taking away people's ability to drive when they're at the moment where they need a job to be able to pay off any fines and fees that they may have, and the cycles that we create in this structure. And so, really with him and how we got involved, it was as simple as him learning about this issue and saying, what can we do? And I think at the federal level, that's often how that happens. And believing that there is a role that we can play, knowing that this is ultimately a state and local issue, but trying to use what we have available at the federal government to play a role. And so the bill creates a grant program for states that have either recently repealed debt-based suspension laws, driver's license suspension laws, or that will do so in the future. And it gives them a small amount of money that they can then use to help with the transition cost for essentially reinstating the driver's licenses that were previously suspended, but now kind of all in bulk will need to be put back in after these laws are repealed. And part of the motivation was that we had been hearing that transition is something that might mean that a state could hesitate to enact these laws. But really, I think the ultimate goal that we have, and certainly Senator Coons has in pushing this bill, is really to try to nationalize this issue and add momentum to what's happening at the local level. As Lisa mentioned, just a few years ago, nearly all states were suspending driver's licenses for unpaid fine and fees, but we've seen a market shift, and we'd like to do what we can at the federal level to help add to that momentum. So if we can pass a bill that sort of creates a sense of a federal policy against this kind of thing, sends some message there, gives other states encouragement to kind of keep the ball moving, gives them something to shoot at with a federal grant program that we think we can help to add to this conversation. That's really what we were trying to do with the bill.
Great. Mr. Richards, anything you want to add? And maybe if you would, talk a little bit about how a senator from Delaware, who's a Democrat, and a senator from Mississippi, who's a Republican, got together about this issue. And a little bit more, if you would, about the bipartisan nature of the support for reform.
Sure, thanks, Lisa. And I'll echo Sarab's comments and say it's certainly an honor to be a part of this distinguished panel and to speak on Senator Wicker's behalf. But believe it or not, Congress does operate in a bipartisan fashion. More ways than you would think. We all hear about the disagreements and the major disagreements, and those are real things. But they generate more headlines than places where we can come together, like the Driving for Opportunity Act. And I think criminal justice reform in general is a place where Congress has people can look each other in the eye and we can find some progress. And here's why I think, and this is the gospel of bread, right? So I just think that criminal justice reform affects everybody, right? Everybody has somebody who has an addiction or who had a problem and who has been in prison or in the correction systems, whatever it is. And so everybody's got a speeding ticket, right? Or at least I have. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I mean, we know what it's like to deal with courts and fees and stuff like that. And so everybody kind of has a general knowledge, right? So you have that working kind of background, in my opinion, that people can kind of understand this on a real level, right? And then I think with this particular provision, the Driving for Opportunity Act, it just makes sense to make this change, right? And so, you hear people talk about common sense reforms a lot, and it's kind of a cliche term, and things are kind of difficult, a little more difficult than just common sense. But this one really is pretty easy, right? And studies have shown that, hey, people collect more money when they stop suspending people's driver's licenses, and it makes sense, right? As Senator Wicker says, suspending somebody's driver's license is counterproductive for collecting their fee. And it really is a specific impact on rural communities like in Mississippi and minority communities in Mississippi as well. And so poverty is not a traffic crime. And so I think people recognize that it's just, what are we doing, And so if you want somebody to pay back a fine or fee, why are we going to tie their hands behind their back and suspend their driver's license? It just doesn't make any sense. So I think as far as the bipartisanship, these sorts of places, these issues are ways where Congress has just seen for the past 30 years what we've been doing isn't working. It affects everybody on a personal level. And so folks are more willing to kind of, make some steps forward together on this. So that's my take. I do think Sarah explained the operational of the bill pretty good. And, like he said, we think the federal government, it's important for the federal government to show an example. And Mississippi has already done that. And for what it's worth, if a state has already done it, they will be reimbursed those fines and fees, or the reimbursement fee will be reimbursed by the federal government. So anyways, that's my 2 cents. I appreciate being here and looking forward to the discussion with everybody.
Thanks. So Senator Mitchell, you're now on the Board of Supervisors at the county level. Are there fines and fees issues that you think the County of Los Angeles should address? And what do you think are the likelihood of additional reform?
Well, I'm proud that the county took additional action last year, 2020, before I arrived, to go further in terms of eliminating fines and fees. I think the question really is broader about, what fines and fees across the board government is imposing on its citizenry, our residents. We recognize that these fines and fees policies had an uptick during the time when we all experienced the Great Recession. And so it really was, I believe, a strategy to pass public service costs directly onto those who were, quite frankly, victims themselves of that public system. And so I've looked at a variety of ways in which government has done this when I was at the state level. Fines and fees elimination was one. Looking at the ways in which law enforcement have managed resources that they take, property they take from individuals, and keep it. So I think that there are a variety of ways in which local government really has to hold itself accountable, even in tough fiscal times, which we are entering now, to make sure that we aren't disproportionately impacting a segment of our communities that are already touched by government systems, and we're not asking them to unfairly bear the burden. I think it's across the board issue beyond fines and fees, just the way in which government functions, particularly in times of crisis and in times of belt tightening.
Right. Mayor Carter, let me ask you, following up a little bit on what Supervisor Mitchell just said, you, like a lot of cities, are probably experiencing some of those budget gaps right now in St. Paul. How do you resist the temptation to go to fines and fees as an additional source of revenue? And are you thinking about more reform in St. Paul?
Thank you. We're always thinking about more reform in St. Paul. We're committed to doing things smarter every day. This work resisting the temptation centers in knowing what we're here to do and understanding the ways in which those fines and fees work against our goals of equity, work against our goals of ensuring that every child can achieve her full potential and every family has the opportunity to succeed. And then it also ties in with something I think that you just said, or someone said earlier, in that, in particular, as we think of, I was laughing because as we think about our policy to eliminate library fines, one of the things we found was we were spending $250,000 a year to collect $215,000 a year in library fines. And so understanding that it's counter-strategic, understanding that it works against our equity goals, and understanding that we've proven over and over again through anecdote, through research, that it's just not an effective way to produce public services. I think it's something that is very important for us. We're continuing to address kind of our impound lot, because the same is true if you lose your car. We could put a map of people in our community who lose their car because their car got towed because of a snow emergency or something else, who they get it towed and they can't afford the $300 or $600 or whatever it is to get their car out of impound. So they lose their car for lack of $300 to $500, somewhere in that space. And of course, those cars are going to be older cars. Of course, those dots on the map are going to be concentrated in our lower income communities. And so one of the things that we're piloting right now is a waiver for individuals who have experienced homelessness, to say that we can waive that fee for individuals in particular who have experienced homelessness. I saw a question about how you do kind of ability to pay. One of the kind of ways, because we're a city, we don't really do income verification well. And so one of the things that we do for some of the programs that we create is identify people who are on public assistance and say, if you're on public assistance and can demonstrate that you're on public assistance, well, this or that waiver can kind of come into play. We're also doing exactly what you just described earlier. We were working at the state to make sure that Minnesota addresses driver's license suspensions. We've had a hearing now in the House and in the Senate. And this is something that's really critical. In this exact same way, we have over just about 15,000 St. Paul residents who have their licenses revoked, and just over 7,000 St. Paul residents were cited for driving after suspension in 2020. We're building out the transit system that we want for the future. But right now, you need a car in St. Paul to get around, to get to work, to get to school, to pick up your children or do, kind of live. And so in that same way, as we were just talking about, if you don't have a car, if you don't have a driver's license, it's going to be very difficult to pay those fines. It's going to be very difficult to catch up on your child support. It's going to be very difficult to pay off the stuff that you got to pay off in order to be reinstated. So these things are putting families into the spiral of poverty, into the debt traps that people are staying in. And forcing people into some really lose-lose situations that aren't just lose-lose for themselves and their families, but they're lose-lose situations for their community. So I think the long view, Lisa, is being able to zoom out, look at it from a 10,000 foot level, and not just say, what press conference do I want to be able to hold, but to say, what is the impact that I really want to have on our community long term? And every time I look at it through that perspective, I can't find how fines and fees and balancing our budgets on the backs of our lowest income residents, on our communities of color, I can't figure out how that is the most equitable solution, how that is the best approach to provide these types of critical public services that we as a city government are here to provide.
Lisa, if I could just piggyback
Sure.
on the mayor's point, he's absolutely right. Not only can we not balance the budgets on the backs of poor people, we also can't justify stopping the services and programs that the fines and fees paid for. Intervention, recidivism, anti-recidivism programs, court-ordered services. In the case of blowing this up, expanding this out a bit, when we tried to reduce, the price of phone calls, the sheriffs pushed back and said, well, that goes to pay for services for inmates. It's like, in county jails in California, where you can't work, you don't earn salary like you do in state prison for doing jobs. It's poor people who are required to put money on your books. And so now they have to then supplement the sheriff's budget through these exorbitantly high phone fees and online visitation fees, since they're eliminating in-person visits, to pay for services that people need while they're locked up. That's the kind of thing we have to do away with and make those services a part of their core operating budget. So while we eliminate the fines and fees, we have to make sure that those critical support services and programs and interventions don't fall through the cracks.
Supervisor Mitchell, I knew I was going to like you when I saw the art behind you. But that is so critical. We get stuck in these zero-sum conversations that tell us, unless we bleed our lowest income residents dry, we won't be able to treat people with humanity, while meanwhile we're spending millions of dollars of other things. And I always remind my community, this is not a budget problem at all. It's a values problem. We have a significant amount of resources that we put towards everything from policing our community to putting a man on the moon. And when we decide that making sure that families can live with dignity in our communities, when we decide that 4-year-old children shouldn't go to sleep hungry, no matter what we think of anything their parents have ever done, that we're not going to be a country where 4-year-old children go to sleep hungry. When we decide that, we'll find out that we can afford to cover all of those types of things that Supervisor Mitchell was just talking about, if they're important to us.
That's right. Families first.
That's a good segue, Senator Smith, to my last question, which is for you. And that is, was there opposition to the bill that you sponsored on juvenile fines and fees? We heard from Supervisor Mitchell about the sheriffs, some opposition to changing some things, but did you have opposition? Who did it come from and how did you address it?
First, I'll say Supervisor Mitchell, definitely, I love the artwork. She wins the Room Raider competition for the panel. So yes, there was opposition, and it mainly from some of my colleagues within the body, and they pointed out just the accountability piece and then the fiscal impact. And when you start to dig in, there is a fiscal impact, and especially within the context of these fees here with our district court and our circuit courts. Now, it creates a weird, perverse incentive where the district court in particular is supposed to be an accessible court. So some of the fees for other services are lower because it's the people's court. And so when you you take those fees off of the book and those fines off the books, then you leave a gap, a budget gap. And so we have to make sure that, again, we're budgeting our values, that through our budgeting process annually, we backfill that. So there was a little bit of a discussion on the fiscal impact and then also just the accountability piece. But when you then take another step backwards, you kind of realize that, look, to borrow the mayor's phrase, it's strategic, because it costs less to incarcerate someone. It costs less to have someone entangled and enmeshed in the justice system than to have them just kind of not entangled with the fines and fees. So I think COVID has provided us this new lens to look through. The silver lining with COVID is that we've, everything from many of the members here watching today have fundamentally changed the way they practice law. I know that when I'm not in the State House, I haven't been into my law office in Washington, D.C., I think twice since the pandemic. And so we've changed the way that we've looked at our problems. And the problem set before us, a lot of the things we do for pre-trial and pre-release were things that were thought to be impossible just 6, 9 months or a year ago. And so when you're able to do some of these innovations under these unique and difficult circumstances, I think you reveal some of the efficiencies and some of the inequities that we've known have existed, but then kind of percolate to the top of mind. And so again, to go back to the initial question, the resistance came from just a fiscal analysis and then some of my colleagues from within the legislature. But ultimately, we came to the conclusion that in the interest of justice and in the interest of long-term fiscal impact, it was actually cheaper and more just and equitable to remove those fines and fees, even for the district court and circuit court where you're supposed to have that access. So for us, it was an interesting debate, but ultimately, I think, the right decisions prevailed and we moved forward. So, it was interesting, to say the least.
So, but before I turn to some of the questions that we've got from the many participants in this webinar, Mr. Steinby, speaking of potential opposition, where's law enforcement on the federal legislation?
Yeah, appreciate you bringing that up, Lisa. It's actually incredible. Law enforcement is extremely supportive of our bill. We have among our not only endorsers but active supporters on this effort, the Fraternal Order of Police, the Major Cities Chiefs Association, Major County Sheriffs of America, National District Attorneys Association. I mean, literally, you name it. And I think it goes from a perspective of they want to focus their resources on how they can best protect public safety, and that does not mean stopping people because they're poor. And so these groups have been so supportive because they want to right size how we approach these issues, and they appreciate the relationship that fines and fees has on taking them away from what they're doing, what they do best. And it actually fits, I think, a bit with the broader police reform conversation we've been having in this country. There's a lot of discussion about the need for accountability in policing, but there's also discussion about thinking about the imprint that police have on our lives and how what's the role that police should be playing. And I think this is a form of that, of right sizing that, where we say, it doesn't make sense for police officers to be serving as debt collectors. They don't, not only do the communities not want that, the police officers don't want that. And if we can find ways like that actually do what some of the more progressive elements of the police reform conversation want to do about fixing policing, but also do it in a way that the Fraternal Order of Police is supportive of and actively supportive of, we know we've hit on something important. And that's something we're trying to highlight with this bill, and that we're trying to push into the conversation where we can.
Great. Well, let me raise a question that many of the members of our audience has raised, and that is the potential conflicts of interest that we see in the system when judges, for example, are imposing fines and fees, but the money goes to their court or to court security or to the retirement fund, or at the municipal level where you have cities that are imposing fines and fees for a variety of municipal code offenses, and that money funds the city budget. So police officers know that their salary may depend on how many tickets they write, and prosecutors know that their salaries may depend on how many of these cases they prosecute. Can any of you talk a little bit about those conflicts, and also whether that generates opposition to the work that you've been trying to do? Senator Mitchell?
Yeah, I mentioned briefly.
Mitchell. I'm used to you as a different title.
I appreciate that. I slip up sometime myself. It'll take a minute. I mentioned earlier, I carried a bill on civil asset forfeiture here in California. And I think I hit a bigger roadblock on that because law enforcement really felt that even though, if a private citizen went through the court process and proved that their resource was not gained through ill-gotten gains, it really was their private property, law enforcement had really begun to plug in a figure in their budget and really oppose the bill from this perspective that I was taking money from them as opposed to trying to protect private citizens' private property. And so you can get into this notion that it's a sense of entitlement around these resources. What we have to do as policymakers, somebody put in the chat that fines and fees weren't written on tablets. It was elected officials, politicians who created them over time, and you're absolutely right. And what we have to do, which is the effort we did and I could do as chair of the budget committee, was to find out what the services that some of the fines and fees actually pay for really cost, and build that into the base budget. So we're not trying to stop the programs and services. We're just trying to stop the charging to private people. And so I think when we began to make it clear to the courts and others that we really were going to take a strategic look at what the fines and fees were paying for, acknowledge that in the 10-year deep recession California fix, the courts took a disproportionate hit, quite frankly. We've been trying to build that back over time. Quite frankly, we tapped into their building funds. We did that. That's what happens in a recession. You go find money wherever you can to keep your state or your municipality afloat. And so now that we are back in the black, and we continue to be in terms of the health of the state's general fund, it was important to really get a sense of what these services cost and pay for them out of the general fund. Once we were were able to tell our past and prove to those who oppose the bill that they could back off a little because they understood it wasn't a matter of trying to take them back to the recession era, but it was an issue of creating a values-based budget that puts families first, that we're not gonna, double tax poor people.
Anyone else have a response to the conflicts problem? Well, then let me turn to one of the other questions that I'm going to summarize a lot of questions, but that is, and again, Supervisor Mitchell, you touched on this. In some cases, we know that, as you mentioned, Mayor Carter, that collection costs more than the revenue that's generated. But in other instances, in fact, there is money being made, right? Traffic tickets, I think, is probably the best example of where, a lot of tickets get issued and a lot of money comes in, and it's a net to the state or the county or the city's bottom line. How do you replace that revenue? What are the options for continuing the services that some of that money provides, but funding them in a different way?
I think that's a difficult question to answer sort of generically. And the reason is because all of those programs are different, right? So with regard to traffic tickets, for example, we have our parking enforcement officers. And we know that hiring a parking enforcement officer is oftentimes revenue positive because they can write enough tickets in the course of a year to offset their own salaries. In some places, we can look at whatever those things are that those fines are covering and say, we can think about the task that we're doing with that completely different. For example, when we eliminated library fines, it created for me, it freed up about 10% of my frontline library staff time. That $250,000 that we were looking to in staff time to be able to collect those funds, it freed us up to do other things. And so I think it's a combination of saying, one, if this is important, we may just have to tax for it. And we may have to put it in our general fund budget and have a conversation with our taxpayers about why this is so important. Two, being willing to take a look through an equity lens and through an effectiveness lens at all of the things that we do and determine, do we need to continue doing the same things the same way? Just saying, how do we replace that revenue suggests that we have to continue doing this other thing the exact same way that we've always done it too, which is a premise that we reject every chance that we get. We can be smarter, we can be more effective, we can be more strategic with all of the things that we do. And then three, it's thinking about some of those things we can stop doing or do in a fundamentally different way that costs less money as well. So I think it's a combination of those kind of general strategies. I don't think there's a one size fits all approach to how you kind of backfill those budgets.
Yeah, and Lisa, sorry, Holly, please.
I was just going to say very briefly that, fines and fees is a huge generic term. SB 144 looked at the fines and fees that impact the criminal and juvenile justice system. In California, to build an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, or to add on a bathroom to your house, depending upon what county you live in, it could be tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars difference based on, what local government has put into place in terms of funding building codes. And so it depends on what fines and fees you're talking about. And I think every level of government has a responsibility to review those, define those, and just make sure that they are not disproportionately impacting one segment of the population over the other. That's the issue. We criminalize poverty with these criminal justice oriented fines and fees. And that was the focus of our bill. But I think when you want to talk more broadly, local government is basically funded based on some kind of fee or assessment. And we have to look at it, just make sure that it's not disproportionately impacting one community over the other. I think that's the overall global view.
Thanks. Mr. Richards, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think it's important to point out that this bill would, still encourage people to pay their fines and fees. I mean, we're not eliminating, look, city budgets aside, right? You can talk about your priorities and what you want to use that money for. I just think it doesn't make any sense to suspend somebody's driver's license if you're trying to get money from them. And so that's the whole point of the Driving for Opportunity Act, is that we want people to not do bad things. That's number one, right? But if you do a bad thing, pay back your debt to society. Now, whether what that is and how much that costs and all those things are different sort of policy discussions. But if you want somebody to actually pay back their debt, let's not tie their hands behind their back and suspend their driver's license at the same time. So I think that's just want to make sure that our bill still allows precincts or people to collect fees. You just can't suspend their driver's license to do it. That's all.
So one of our audience members asked a question about another area where driver's license suspension is common, and that's child support enforcement. So in fact, the federal government requires states to have at least a law in place that allows for driver's licenses to be suspended if someone does not pay their child support. And many of the same arguments are made with respect to child support as are made with respect to fines and fees. How do you expect parents to pay their child support debt if they can't drive to work? How are they supposed to go see their kids, take them to school, get them to the doctor's office, take them to a park or the zoo if they don't have a car, or if they don't have a license and can't drive a car? So anyone want to address that question and whether there's any prospect for reform with respect to unpaid child support?
I think this requires going upstream of all of this. I think the statement that you just made, Lisa, points out really clearly that we need more than just forgiveness of certain fines and fees. We need a fundamentally different paradigm for how we provide public services and how we secure law. The question around child support, for example, is whether we want to punish the person who owes back due child support, or whether we want to increase the likelihood that that child can experience the benefits of having the supportive resources, right? When we just say we're going to, suspend your driver's license, you can't get to work, you can't get to school, you can't get to training, whatever you're doing, and you probably won't be able to make that money back, and it'll create this kind of endless cycle. We actually reduce the likelihood that that child is going to be able to benefit from that. When we create our public safety system, there's lots of research that shows our juvenile justice system, for example, increases the likelihood of a young person to be an adult offender, not decreases it. And so this is what we're after in the first place, is to say, we need an outcomes-based approach to public safety that's going to focus on the outcomes that we desire to produce for our neighborhoods, over saying we're going to punish somebody for doing something bad. Because what we found is those punishments, those fines, those fees, those sanctions, whatever we call them, have not brought us to the place where our community level outcomes are better. They've not brought us to the place where we're safer. They've not brought us to the place where people are more likely to pay back that child support. They've not brought us to the place where people are more likely to pay off those fines. It is not just a regressive, but a counter strategic that pushes away from where we want to do. Child support is absolutely on our list as well. But at some level, our goal is, I think, to get upstream of all of these kind of individual, what about bail? What about car, impound fees? What about driver's licenses? What about this? To say, wait a minute, what about impact? What about the world that we're trying to build? What about effective delivery of public services? What about raising our children to achieve their full potential? What if those things were our top, highest, uncontested priorities, not trying to figure out how to get back at somebody for doing something that offended our sensibilities?
So Senator Smith, I know you've got to leave us in a few minutes. So any last thoughts or ideas about what might be happening next in Maryland?
Sure. Just a parenthetical to the mayor's comments on child support, but for again, being one of those 14 states that did the driver, stop the practice of suspending driver's licenses for fees, lowering the threshold for repayment plans. But since we passed that, the Attorney General's bill into law last year, a year and a half ago, 89,000 driver's licenses have been reinstated and restored. I mean, this is a pervasive problem. We're a state of just over 6.5 million people. So this is a significant step forward in ensuring that folks can kind of get back onto the road to restoration and to recovery and to reintegration. So just a parenthetical thought on that. It's a very pervasive problem for even a mid-sized small state like Maryland. But other than that, I just want to say thank you to the panelists and thank you for all of your work. It's been a pleasure to be here with you. And in Maryland, we're moving forward. Again, we've got a couple of issues before us in the last 15 days of our legislative session. Among them, body attachment. So I'm looking forward to working with our Attorney General on that. So with that, I'll just bid you adieu and say thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure and an honor.
Thank you. We appreciate you being with us. So another question that a lot of our participants have asked is, and it really relates to both Mr. Richards, your comments, and Mayor Carter's, yours, and that is, if fines and fees are not appropriate, and then what should the sanctions be? So for someone who violates the law, and setting aside for a minute whether we think all the things that are currently criminal offenses should remain criminal offenses, about which I think there's a fair amount of disagreement. But let's assume there's some things that we all agree upon. I don't think anybody thinks that folks should be speeding through residential neighborhoods with impunity, or that there shouldn't be a sanction if you steal something from a store or from a person. So how do we begin to think about what's appropriate as a sanction for violating the law?
I'll take a stab. I don't really know the answer to that question. I think that's kind of the difficult thing we're going through here, right? I mean, look, again, I do think in some situations a fine or fee is appropriate as a sanction. A speeding ticket, people pay them, and you shouldn't speed through residential neighborhoods or school zones, like you say, right? I personally think with this bill specifically, though, collecting that fee, that's what I'm kind of focused on. Collecting that fee, you shouldn't suspend somebody's driver's license if they can't pay. So again, it just goes back to how do you do those things? That's a whole different subject. I bet Sarah probably has some insight on that, on what appropriate sanctions are. But as far as collecting those appropriate sanctions, suspending somebody's driver's license just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I feel like I'm hogging the game clock here, but I would agree with some of those things. I think you're right. I live in a block where we see cars speed down where my children play. I don't want to see them speeding down, and I don't want people to think that this is a place where you can just do that with impunity. It's I think often how we put on the enforcement mechanisms, and we put the enforcement mechanisms to back people into a corner. The other thing I say is, one of the things that we find is the outcomes that occur in a certain place are a function of the design of that place, right? The example that I use for my constituents here is, if I put a basketball hoop on my driveway, then people will play basketball there because there's a basketball hoop there. So a lot of times when we see kind of public failures, where we see parking tickets, for example, if we have a number of parking tickets that come from a certain place, that means not that it's an opportunity for us to make a whole bunch of parking ticket revenue. That means that's probably an opportunity for us to make more clear what the parking requirements are, what the parking rules are in that certain place. And so more often than not, I think when we see just massive rule breaking in our communities, it's a function of an opportunity, a missed opportunity for us to be far more proactive. And so our goal here in St. Paul isn't to just kind of leap out from behind the bushes and catch people in doing wrong every time and have a sanction for them. Our goal, first and foremost, is to get proactive on the front end and say, how do we create the systems? How do we create the neighborhoods? How do we create the streetscape? How do we design this road, this street right here, so that it's better designed so that it doesn't facilitate speeding in that way? Because oftentimes speeding in neighborhood districts is a reflection of poor street design that helps to facilitate the cars moving faster than we actually want them to go. And so our first goal, I think, has to be about programming our public spaces and our public systems to more effectively produce the type of outcomes that we have. And then our second goal is going to say, when we do determine that sanctions are appropriate, and they will be sometimes, how do we create accountability mechanisms? How do we create collection mechanisms? How do we create those mechanisms in ways that either one, don't block access to the things that people, their families, their children need to be able to, and two, maybe do it equitably with some ability to pay in mind, so that we're not regressively charging the highest rates to our lowest income families.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I'm going to use my prerogative as the moderator and tell you all about a study that was just done in Seattle, Washington, where they found that the simple act of putting a sign with the speed limit on it slowed traffic down. That the more times on a multi-block area, you simply had a sign that said 25 mph or 35 mph, whatever it was, the more people adhered to the speed limit. And it goes to your observation, Mayor Carter, that sometimes it's the design of what we do and how we do it that needs to be reinforced as opposed to the sanction. So let me ask one additional question that's, again, appeared frequently in the chat, and that is, and the bipartisan nature of this. How do we reach across the aisle, and what are the areas of common ground that you can find to make these reforms happen, particularly in places that haven't begun to think about them yet?
Well, it is bipartisan on the federal level, I'll say. I mean, on the state level, it's tough out there. These things, people are very passionate these days. And so we are trying to find ways to lead by example, I guess, on the federal level. And so, look, again, we were talking about the police and law enforcement. I think law enforcement is a big supporter because they recognize we're wasting their time right now. And so when we find ways that we can kind of come together on this stuff, let's just do it. And let's stop talking about it. I mean, we're super close on the, look, I'm trying to manage expectations here, but I mean, we have a really good opportunity to get this bill passed on the federal level. And it's because of people engaging with their representatives, educating their folks, like, hey, have you heard about Senator Wicker and Senator Coons' bill? The House side, I'm not sure. I don't think they've introduced it yet this Congress, but it's maybe they have. But again, like engaging folks, educating their members. There are lots of bills out there, to be honest with you. And so getting folks just to be aware of this bill that's going on, and there is a bipartisan kind of push in this area, is super helpful. Instead of them just hearing from a staffer like me who annoys them and says, hey, can your boss be a co-sponsor? It's so much more impactful coming from people out there in the states and just show like, hey, there are some bipartisan solutions that we can all work together on. You just have to kind of voice that to your people and let them know, because people who, I tell you who's calling in, it's folks who disagree on things, and where there are, like they are calling in to tell you, don't do something. Please call in and tell our bosses to do something. That's a new change, and that would be, in my opinion, super helpful for our efforts. So.
Right. And I would just add, we've been talking about the bill that Senator Coons and Senator Wicker have been leading, but I'd be remiss not to mention that, when we introduced last week, we also had 4 other Republican co-sponsors, including Senators Grassley, Boozman, Ernst, and Langford, as well as 4 Democrats and additional Democrats. And, I think certainly at the federal level, a lot of it comes down to your commitment to how you want to legislate and your commitment to bipartisanship from the beginning. And in this bill, we did not, there were so many different iterations to how we looked at the payment structure, the grant program. Should it be a mandate? Should we be cutting federal money off if the jurisdiction doesn't do this or not? And we had to go through a lot of drafts with a lot of our partners on the right, groups like Americans for Prosperity and Americans for Tax Reform and Freedom Works, and really find something that everyone in this sort of coalition that we had built together agreed on. And it was at that time that we started finding partners, and then and Senator Wicker's office joined our efforts, but it was really we had no intention of ever introducing this bill until it was bipartisan, and to do all of our work in a way that made sure it would be bipartisan the whole way through. And I think holding to that and doing that hard work to take away certain things if they aren't going to get you there, it was part of how we got it done, for this bill.
So let me ask another question about, and this is again about working across jurisdictional lines. So Mayor Carter, does it help you if your United States Senator is also in support of the kind of work that you want to do at the local level? If they were to, does it, and conversely, maybe Mr. Steinby or Mr. Richards, does it help you to know that the mayor of a particular state is in support of what you're doing? Are there a way to really cross lines here?
There's definitely ways to cross lines. I always tell my constituents that no matter how many people make this look like an individual sport, it's really a team sport. That, our ability to work closely with our senators and our Congress members, our governor, our state legislators, our county board, all of those things are absolutely critical for our ability to produce kind of just outcomes. For example, I think Supervisor Mitchell was talking earlier about how much it costs to make a phone call from jail. Those are things we have to work with our county to impact, and we are working with our county to impact some of those things. But in order to kind of deliver on this vision, as opposed to just being able to, like I said earlier, have a fun press conference, in order to deliver on sort of a global vision, we have to have that type of teamwork. I'm very fortunate in both of our U.S. senators that I have very short phone calls about stuff like this. When I call them and say, "Hey, just wanted to let you know I'm working on this, or I'm working on that." They're, of course, very supportive and very encouraging, and it gives us the opportunity to both kind of have those conversations in Washington, D.C., but also to have them as advocates here in our conversations, whether it's at the state capitol or whether it's with our constituents about the world that we're moving forward towards.
I would just add, if I may, I think in a strange, tragic kind of way, our shared experiences now as a result of living through and trying to navigate our way through this pandemic, this dual pandemic, a public health and economic pandemic, has created a mass awareness, a new awareness around, income disparity. Just as this virus has disproportionately impacted people who could least afford it and who could least afford to stay safe at home because they were our frontline workers, they were our family, friends, and neighbors who are unhoused or housing insecure or require, rely on public transportation to get to work. I think that there is a heightened sensitivity among our shared constituencies and among every level of government. So this is a unique opportunity in time to do the kind of innovative, engage in the kind of innovative strategies that the mayor has around supporting people who are living in poverty. And so in times where there may not have been empathy or understanding at multiple levels of the government for certain segments of our community, I think we are in a different and new time. And now was the time for us to elevate all of these issues, to create, not to allow us to return to normal, but to create a new normal for many of the members of our society as we navigate our way through a recovery and come out of this dual public health and economic pandemic. Now is a time for us to have these kind of public policy conversations and affect some change.
And I would just say about the local officials and the relationship to the federal level, I think it absolutely makes a difference. And the number of offices that I've spoken to about this bill, where the question is, okay, we need to go back and talk to our in-state people about it, or, it happens all the time. And I think, I know this is said a lot, but it's just important to reinforce it. I don't think people always realize how much power they have to drive what senators work on and what Senate staff work on, in the sense of, your calls matter, and certainly elected officials making calls matters. But when you reach out, when we have constituents saying something about an issue, we have limited time, and our bandwidth can only be spent on so many things. And when we have outreach from in state on different issues, that it can make a big difference on what sorts of things we get involved in. I think that's particularly true on these sort of bipartisan issues, where a Republican office that might not otherwise be inclined to be engaged can get the nudge they need to say, actually, maybe we'll take a look at that because of the outreach we've been getting.
Yeah, and it always helps to have a good hashtag too. You got to have a good hashtag out there. Hashtag D40, driving for opportunity. I'm thinking that's the way it's going to be. But seriously, I appreciate y'all's perspectives on this. This has been a really great conversation. I'm hoping that we can get this pushed across the line on the federal level and signed by the president, and encourage those states to do the right thing. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. And I know, Brett, I know you were being somewhat tongue-in-cheek about hashtags, but it is a good reminder that we're not going to move the hearts and the policies and the budgets on Twitter, that this is going to require these types of conversations. It's going to require these types of conversations, not just with the incredible people on our screen right now who already agree and are excited about this work, but those kind of outcome-oriented conversations with people on the other side of the aisle. With people who may not have woken up this morning excited about this type of worldview, to say, what are the outcomes that we want? Where are we trying to get? And what is the best road to kind of get us where to what you just described? So I appreciate this conversation modeling that.
Well, thank you all for being with us today and having really an amazing conversation about what all of you are doing at the local, state, and federal level, and also how we can work together and solve some of these problems. I think the participation of our audience being here throughout this session is just testament to the fact that these issues are important to people and they care a lot about people, and we need to solve them if we're going to have the kind of public safety and strong communities that we all want and deserve. So thank you so much. Again, I'm going to take a 2-second moderator's prerogative. If you want to learn more about any of these issues, about any of the bills that were mentioned today, about the work that's going on in local communities, or the details of the Driving for Opportunity Act, you can go to our website at finesandfeesjustice.org. We have a clearinghouse online. It has everything in it that you might want to know about reform in the country with respect to fines and fees. And Malia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the ABA, I just want to thank our audience for joining us and thank our esteemed group of panelists. You all are doing such critical work, and we thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to share your experiences. As I said at the outset, this is part of a series run by the ABA Section on Civil Rights, Social Justice. Please visit that website for upcoming webinars and resources. In addition, ABA SCLAID has a number of resources on fines and fees as well. We really appreciate your activity on these issues. The ABA is fully engaged on this as well and hope to continue being active leadership on this in the future. So best of luck in your work. Stay safe, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you all.